In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can create the illusion of graphics morphing into one another using Adobe After Effects. Similar to a previous tutorial where I showed you how to morph shapes into one another, you can take that same concept and make it appear that graphics morph into one another. Now it's going to work a little differently than the shapes working into one another. It's still going to require some paths that you can create in After Effects, but there's going to be some subtle differences. So let's go ahead and get this started. You're going to first create your graphics. Your graphics, however, aren't going to be graphics that you bring in from Illustrator. They're going to have to be brought in from Photoshop. And they can't just be any kind of Photoshop file. They have to be a PNG file or a PNG file. They have to be set to the color mode of RGB. And they have to be pretty solid, meaning that, as you can see, there's no breaks in this graphic. So, since it's based off of paths, you don't want something that's got spaces in between it where I could see the background through it, for example, because you want one single path. Just like in the shapes, where it was one single path, your graphics are going to have to be one single path as well. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Now, we'll give you a warning, and you'll see it as we start building this file, that this takes a little time to do because of the rendering. We'll talk a little bit more about that later when we get to it. You're also going to want to make sure that your files that you're morphing them into, even though you can morph small graphics into large graphics and vice versa, you're still going to want to make sure that the PNG file that you set up is not bigger than your work area in After Effects. Because if the path, or rather the graphic, is bigger and that you have to scale it down, when you go and create it into a path, or convert it to a path rather, you're not going to be able to scale the path down. So just to reiterate, your graphics have to be created in Photoshop. They can be created in Illustrator and then brought into Photoshop, but they have to be smaller than your work area. So to show you, we'll go to our composition settings and we can see that the width is 960 and the height is 540, meaning that when you build these in Photoshop as your PNG files, you're not going to want it bigger than these measurements. You want it to kind of fall into it. So for this particular project, we'll show you. Here is what we would call a master file. And in the master file, to create these graphics for you, we basically put them on multiple layers. So I have an hourglass, I have the clock. You can see we changed the clock a little bit so that it's continuous graphics and not separated into multiple graphics. But what's more is note that the composition of this is smaller than my work area. So that way when I bring these graphics into After Effects and I convert them into paths, that the paths will be bigger and I won't have to worry about not being able to scale them because, as I said, once you convert it to a path in here in After Effects, if the path exceeds the space, you're not going to be able to scale it down. You're going to have to go in and adjust the original graphic. So as a rule of thumb, if you know you're going to be converting shapes, graphics, in After Effects, then you're going to probably want to create yourself a file that is smaller than your work area in After Effects, and then kind of size however you want them to be. Just make sure that they're smaller. And even though I've sized these guys to be about pretty much the same size, you can morph, just like in shapes, smaller graphics into larger graphics. The main thing is the workspace, and that you don't want to exceed that. Okay. So, as you can see, I've imported into After Effects here, I've imported 3 graphics, an hourglass, a watch, and a clock. Now, because of rendering time, I'm only going to show you how to morph one graphic into another graphic, but the same principle is going to apply, plus with some other things that you've probably learned already in After Effects that will create the actual illusion of one graphic morphing into one, and then that graphic morphing into another. And to create that, it's going to be the same kind of effects that we do here, but notice on the timeline, I can adjust on the timeline how long an animation stays on the screen. So, for example, the hourglass begins at 1 second, and then after 3 seconds it stops, and you're no longer going to see it on the screen. The watch also is going to stop, but I created a duplicate layer so that it looks like it's continuous and then morphs into another graphic. And I have to do it like this. I can't use the same watch one because this watch is parented to the hourglass for morphing purposes. And for morphing purposes, if I want it to look like the watch then continues to morph, then I've got to create a new one and parent it to the next graphic that I want it to morph into. And then adjusting these time lengths so that it stays on the screen only a certain amount of time. As always, the timeline is going to become really kind of important for you because you don't want it to go too slow, but you also don't want it to go too fast. You just want it to stay on the screen long enough so that the viewer can recognize what it is, and it holds long enough for the viewer to continue to recognize what it is. If it goes too slow, you don't have that time, ironically enough, to make them go that slow. Conversely, you don't want it to go too fast where they can't see or recognize the shapes that they're turning into. A little bit more on the timeline. Again, the ends of these is how long it stays on screen. So, as you can see, it's on screen, but if I were to move these, you can see they disappear because this, the edge, is where they actually begin. Nothing, and then something. Alright, so let's get started with the actual morphing. I'm going to turn these guys off, turn on our hourglass, and turn on our watch. And as you can see, we've brought them in. First thing that you're going to want to do, let's turn our watch off for a second, is you're going to select the graphic, you're going to go up to Layer, scroll down, and select Auto Trace. This dialog box is going to come up. The default settings are usually what you want, but just to kind of go over it really quickly, just make sure that the tolerance is set to 1 and the threshold set to 50. And then what you'll see is it creates a path. And if I open this up, you'll actually see that it creates what they call a mask. This mask is what we're going to use to create the actual morphing effect. So different from the shapes, it's not creating a path, it's creating a mask, but similar to the shapes, it's creating a mask that is in points, and it takes on the shape of the graphic. So let's click on the mask, the return key, and let's name this hourglass mask. Close this up, open up my watch. We'll open this up so that you can see that before you do the trace, all it has is your traps on it. So I'll select the watch, go to the layer, auto trace. Default settings are fine. Tolerance of 1, threshold of 50. And it creates my mask. Open up my mask, select my mask, hit the return key, name the mask. Now, even though I'm not going to animate the clock, we'll do it with the clock just so you can get the rhythm of it. Select the graphic, go to Layer, select Auto Trace, default settings, tolerance of 1, threshold of 50. Open masks, select the mask, hit return, name the mask. Just like we talked about with the shapes layers and morphing shapes, it's important that you name them because this will remove any confusion of, did you convert this one? Yes, you did because you took the time to name it. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start the morphing. And what we're going to do is we're going to morph our hourglass into the watch. To do that, we're going to need an effect. And over in Effects and Presets, you're going to type in the words reshape. And when reshape comes up, it's going to give you a distortion effect that's what's actually going to do the morphing. And now you can see some of the major differences between this and morphing shapes. So we'll open up our hourglass. I'm going to click on the mask. And since this is the hourglass's mask, I'm going to set this to add. This is the blending methods. I'm going to take reshape. I'm going to drag it onto my hourglass. And you can see it now adds my effects. To get the hourglass to transform into the watch, I've got to take the watch's mask, select it, copy it, then click on the masks for my hourglass and paste it. And as you can see, it now has my watch mask. If it's the hourglass shape, then I'm going to want its mask set to add and the watch mask set to none. And to get these to morph into one another, you wind up having to do the same thing to the watch because these two shapes are parented to one another because you're shaping these guys into one another. So now we're ready to start the first half of the morph, where I get the hourglass to morph into the watch. So now that I have my effects set onto it, right up here, the source mask. The source mask is whatever the layer is named after. In this case, it's the hourglass. So that means for the hourglass, the source mask is going to be the hourglass. Destination is what I want to change it into. So on the hourglass layer, I'm changing it into the watch. So destination mask is watch mask. Just think of destination mask as and source mask as what is it, and then destination is what is it changing into. What is it? What is it changing into? And you don't have to worry about boundary mask. The percent is what you're actually going to animate to create the morph. We'll get onto that in a second. Elasticity. Stiff is going to make it look really slow and kind of awkward. And since morphing is kind of like Terminator 2, it's liquid, you'd probably want to select one of the bottom three, loose, liquid, or superfluid. Loose is usually fine. The interpolation method, you're going to want to set it to linear. That way, when it's doing the math to create the morph, it's making as few mathematical calculation mistakes as possible. So, we have our settings. We're now ready to start animating this morph. And remember, it's through the percent. So it's going to start off with 0 and then end in 100. So we'll start with the timeline. If I open up mask, you'll see that a path has already been created for us, a keyframe. We're going to want to turn those off because we want to create our own and not by default. To review that, when you do the auto trace and it creates the mask, by default it gives you a keyframe, and you're going to want to get rid of those keyframes because you're creating your own. Auto trace on the clock. Once I've converted it to an auto trace of a mask, I'm going to open it up, select the mask path, click the stopwatch, and turn off the keyframe. Delete it, really. Because I'm going to create my own. Okay. So let's go to our hourglass. Let's open it up. And we're ready to now start making the hourglass morph into the watch. So we'll start off at 0, and I'm going to set a keyframe, my own keyframe, based off of %. You can't see it in here because you don't have effects turned on. So when you open up the effects and open up reshape, you'll see under %, there's my keyframe. So let's scroll it down a little bit. We'll say it about 1 second. And in 1 second's time, it's going to morph into the watch. If I want it to morph later than that, then I would start off, let's say I'll move this to 1. I'll start off my 0% at 1. That way, when it comes onto the screen, it will be on the screen long enough for someone to recognize what it is and not instantly morph. And I usually recommend doing this. So we have one keyframe at 1 second set to 0, and let's go to 2 seconds. I'll set this to a 100%. It creates the keyframe for me, and then it starts morphing it. Now, you may look at this and say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't look like the hourglass. It looks like a mess. You just got to trust me when I say we're not done with the process yet. I freaked out like this too when I first did these, but once I went through the process, you'll see that it actually winds up working itself out. Okay. So now what I need to do is I need to do the same effect but in reverse for the watch, meaning that I'm going to set the same concept for the watch to morph into the hourglass but in reverse, so that it starts off a mess and then morphs into the watch. And that's what clears this mess up, is that by doing it in reverse, it means it will pick up at the same spot a mess like this. I'll advance it down a second and then do it in reverse so that it literally will then morph from this mess into the final watch. Alright, so I'm going to start with by taking the hourglass mask, I'm sorry, copy it, open up my watch, click on masks, and paste it. And there's my hourglass mask. Since this is the watch mask, it needs to be add, and since the hourglass mask is visiting, it needs to be set to none. Let's open them up, make sure that we don't have any other keyframes on them, and we're fine. We're going to leave our timeline right here because this is where I need it to convert from this mess into the watch. So I'm going to take my reshape and drag it to my watch layer. In reverse, since this is the watch, the destination, the source is the watch, and I'm turning it into the hourglass. Don't have to worry about boundary mask. We don't have to worry about % just yet. We're going to set it to loose because the other one was loose. And and set it to linear. So it's basically the same. And now I'm ready to start animating this. So we're going to create a percent. Let's open up effects down here so you can see it. We're going to create a percent time keyframe on the timeline, but we start with 100%. Create a keyframe, go down 1 second, and create another keyframe at 0%. Now, let's take a look and see how this works out. Let's bring it back to the home. This is what I was telling you about earlier, that this takes a little time to render. And this is why it's going to be the longest part of this, that we may want to set this, our resolution, we'll set it down to about 1/3, and that may speed up the render time rather. Even though it looks pixelated, once it renders through, you'll be able to see that once it renders through, then it starts running at normal speed. But it just takes a little time to do all the math of calculating this shape and all the math that it needs to line it up to the next shape. We're also going to adjust our work area down so it's not rendering all of this, it's just going to render the area that I need. Alright, so once you press play, that's when it's going to start rendering it. And you see that green line? That's it doing the math. And by setting it to 1/3, it will render it a little quicker. Alright. So let's go back to home. You may say to yourself, well, let's scrub through the timeline. You know, man, Mr. Wally, it's still looking kind of like a mess. Well, I got to expand my work area, and we're going to want to render that too. Let's just draw this out. So it renders the rest of it. All right. Now, before you panic, we've got one more step that we have to do. So you may be saying to yourself, well, geez, Mr. Wally, it's still kind of, looking like a mess. It's because we've got one more thing that we have to do. We have to animate a trap. We have to animate an opacity trap so that it looks like it starts off as the hourglass, but then it's going to slowly, opacity-wise, fade out into revealing the watch underneath. Let me show you. Set this to full. In my original animation, you can even see the opacity is what winds up doing it, is that it makes it morph into the watch. I got the other 2 layers off, but it makes it morph into the watch, and then the watch holds, and then morphs, and you can see that it's an opacity animation that makes it look like it actually transforms into the clock. So let's take our hourglass and just kind of show you. You can see there's my opacity. Let's turn it on so we can see it. And this is all you have to do, is that it starts off at 100%, and then you can see it slowly changes into 0% when it gets to the next morph, the transition. All right, turn those off so we can take our watch. These guys off too. Let's turn on our hourglass. Let's open it up. Let's go to transform. Let's set an opacity at 100%. Scroll down. You basically got to kind of scroll through till you see it start to change. And then we'll set another opacity to 0. So let's close this up. Turn on our watch. I got a feeling that we may have these kind of in reverse, so let's just double check. So I've got my watch. It should transform out. There we go. All right. And again, this is the longest part of it. Let's render it out. Now I've mistakenly didn't adjust it back to a quarter, but I recommend setting it as a half or a quarter because it takes less rendering time. And we can also have adjusted our workspace a little bit so that it wouldn't have to render all this, but you'll see once it renders through, then it renders at normal speed. So let's pause this for a second. Go back to home. Just our work area here a bit. And then, as I said, and it's like this with all After Effects, that's when you just wind up having to go back in and tweaking it, but you're tweaking pretty much the reshape and the percent, making sure that you set one and then you set the other one to the exact opposite of it. So that when it renders through, it creates a morphing of one graphic into another. And if you want to create the effect, as we have here in the demo, of it morphing into one graphic, and then that graphic morphing into another graphic, so you can see it, it's the same process that you just did. The only differences is you're going to have to duplicate. It's going to have to be parented to the new graphic that you want to morph it into. And then you may have to adjust the timeline so that it stops on screen, but then it literally picks up into the same thing, which is the new morphing. As that new morph takes place, it creates the illusion of it morphs into a watch. But the new morphing effect is the watch into a clock, so it creates the illusion that it stays on screen long enough for it to morph into the clock. So it's a little bit of a process. It even took me a while to get my hands wrapped around it, but again, once you realize that most of it is done with the reshape and understanding that you're literally parenting one, and you can only morph one graphic into another graphic. In other words, I can't, that's why we have it as 2 on the timeline here. I can't morph this into the watch and then have this watch morph into the clock. You can only morph one path into another. So that's why you got to duplicate it and then adjust it, how long it's on the screen for and when it stops, things like that. So this is pretty much how you morph graphics into other graphics in Adobe After Effects.